Listo. Entonces, bienvenido.
Gracias, Alejandra. Buenas, ¿qué hubo? ¿Están despiertos? Hay algunos están. ¿Y quién le gusta la seguridad? Bueno, tres. Hay tres personas que le gusta la seguridad, con razón. Bueno, I don't blame you. Um, bueno, para principiar, yo soy americano con padres colombianos. Mi papá es de Cali, mi mamá de Begué, mi papá vive en Bucaramanga ahora y mi primera vez en Medellín, al fin, me toca. Me cae muy lindo aquí. Um, pero para un discurso técnico yo lo voy a hacer en inglés. Si no, me sale vapor de la mente, del cerebro, porque es mucho trabajo. Um, si prefieren español, métese en Hopin y la princesa Diana lo hace la traduzca, ¿no? La translation, ni sé. Um, bueno, ahora en inglés. I've been a software developer for 30 years. Well, developer, I've been in software for 30 years. I've been a C++ developer, worked in startups, Microsoft, everything in between. I've been a security architect, consultant, identity and access management architect, and more recently, a cloud security architect. Um, so I've seen a lot, and I'll be sharing a lot of stories about that in today's talk. Um, so I'm also the founder of a consulting company, Clave Security, nice Spanglish company. And we have a booth out front. You want to stop by? We're the ones with all the chocolates. So anyway, um, so when you think about DevSecOps, maybe the first thing you think about is this kind of a diagram, right? Where you add security to each phase of the development cycle and each phase of the operations cycle. And this diagram is a great place to start. It captures a lot of the processes necessary to incorporate security into DevOps. Um, I'm going to take a bit of a step back and really talk about more security basics and kind of circle back and return to this diagram at the very end of the talk. So I'm really aiming this for DevOps professionals who really want to start to understand the fundamentals of security. You know, instead of just looking at, say, you know, instead of just looking at scans, looking at, looking at your dashboards all in red, the sky is falling, something bad is happening. You know, why why do we care about that? What is security about, right? So is it about the bits and the bytes of an attack? No. Like the big letters say, security is about adding value to the business. You know, you want to talk about it's what is the impact of the business of a vulnerability, of a threat, of an attack. You know, that's what matters. Your scans are always going to be red. You know, you're always gonna find something, and every day of the year, pretty much, right? But you can't go running into a VP's office every day and say, "The sky is falling." No, you're not. You can't do that every day because hopefully not every day the sky is falling. Occasionally it will, but not every day. You need to be able to um, you need to be able to assess, what really matters in that time and at that place. Um, and you also need to be able to communicate with non-technical people, even the technical people, to be honest, because the technical people, 95% of them won't know security, right? So you need to be able to explain to people, why does this matter? You know, you need to be able to talk to someone in, even if it's your VP of the engineering. Why does this matter to him? If you need to talk to the business, why does this matter? Um, so I'll share a personal story, a bit of a confession. Um, my first job as a security architect, I actually was really terrible at it. um, I knew all the technology, I knew all the bits and the bytes. I understood the security part really well. Um, but um, as a security architect, you start working with product management, you start working with the business. And so very early on, I um, I found some really serious problem, really serious security problem, like want to make your hair stand on end, right? It's like, it's like worst thing you could possibly find. And so I run into the product manager's office and this is really, really bad. We got to fix this now. It's like, this is really bad. And, and so his question to me is like, okay, what's the business case for that? And I had been a C++ developer for 20 years. I'm like, the business case? This is bad. You got to fix this. But what's the business case? Now it's kind of like, I had nothing to say, right? So, you know, so from a technical perspective, things may be really obvious to you that something really, really needs to get fixed. But you need to articulate it in the language of the person you're talking to. As I've been in the room where we're talking to developers about security for the first time. It's like, well, you have to start using this secure function versus this insecure string copy function or something, right? And the guy shoots back and it's like, I've been using string copy for 25 years. Why do I have to change now? I just had a meeting last week with somebody who was like, I write industrial software. Why do I have to upgrade third-party libraries? Why do I have to do vulnerability scans? Nobody can break into this stuff. It's like, well, so it's a matter of education, you know, at all levels. Developers, managers, VPs, architects, the business. It's a matter of educating people so they really kind of understand why it is this stuff matters, right? So I'll be discussing some security fundamentals, discussing all of those terms, the CIA, the difference between a threat, vulnerability, and a risk, CVEs, NVDs, CVSS. I feel so sorry for my translator now since it must be terrible. Threat models, attack surfaces, controls, defense in depth, all of those. They're basic terms, really, but that's a lot of times they might be thrown around without really understanding them. And there are some distinctions that are important to understand. So first of all, the CIA, and no, not that guy, right? In security world, the CIA triad refers to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? So obviously confidentiality, nobody else can see your data. Integrity, nobody can corrupt your data. And availability, you can access your data from any time, anywhere, right? And you can kind of start to see how a lot of basic security controls flow directly from there. You talk encryption, that'll keep you from getting the corrupted data, right? You want to protect data at rest. You want to protect data in transit. You want to talk confidentiality, so you're talking authentication. You're talking authorization, access controls, ACLs, ACLs. Um, you want to talk availability, so now first thing that comes to my mind is the kind of high availability you get with the cloud, right? So all real basic properties that drive a lot of what's going on in security. So vulnerabilities, threats, and risks. So at first it may seem kind of interchangeable, right? You might not make a strong distinction between them. I'll start with vulnerabilities on the right-hand side. So when you talk about a vulnerability, it's really a flaw. Some sort of flaw in the program or in your network or in your architecture that can be exploited, right? And can create problems for you, right? So could be a bug, could be poor controls, could be, um, it could be an inadequate BCP, an inadequate business continuity plan. Just could be a mistake by humans. Um, so you got vulnerabilities and you got threats. It's funny how angry employees are the first one. And in reality, when you think about threats, everybody thinks about hackers. Bad hackers are going to get my stuff, and they do. But honestly, the biggest threat are insiders. They have very good access to everything. Often that access is not audited. So an insider is actually the biggest threat you're going to find. You're like the state-sponsored, attacks make all the headlines. It's the insiders who do most of the stuff. Um, so, and then you have risk. Um, so risk is kind of where you're trying to evaluate just how serious is this vulnerability? What could happen, to the business if somebody exploits this vulnerability? Do you lose money? Do you lose client data? Do you lose personally identifiable information, PII? And if you lose PII, well, then you could have problems, say, like with privacy laws. European privacy laws are very strict. If you're found in violation of the European privacy law, it can be up to 2 to 4% of the company's earnings globally. And you may have seen some articles where like Facebook or Google get fined by the EU for GDPR problems. And you also have risks from like loss of business, right? So customers find out that you've been hacked or something like this. It's never good for business. And you also have to consider, say, just where your business might be. If you're a small business, your potential losses are relatively small, because you just don't have that much money. You're not going to have that much customer data probably if you're a small business. You probably won't face legal penalties either because you're so small, no one will notice. But if you're like Microsoft, now everything becomes a big deal. If somebody breaks into a Microsoft product, it's a headline somewhere, right? They have hundreds of millions, billions of customers. So losing that customer data is a big deal, right? They will get the fines, right? So something that might be a risk for Microsoft might not be a big risk for a smaller company. Same flaw, same vulnerability, same threat, but it might not be as big a risk. So how much risk is a business willing to tolerate? So most companies wish or think they were like the guy in the big winter jacket. I've been in places where the product managers insisted we're like 99.99% safe, right? And it's like, no, we're like 99.99% certain that we will get broken into. um, so in reality, most people are like Tom Cruise hanging onto the airplane. They just don't want to think about that. Um, but it's also hard to answer the question of how much risk you're willing to tolerate. And nobody wants risk, but nobody can afford to pay for being perfectly safe. If you wanted your car to be perfectly safe, your car would look like a tank. You'd be stopping at a gas station every 5 miles. And even if you did drive a tank, tanks can still get blown up. So, you could spend, I don't know what a tank costs, $500,000? I don't know. But it could still get blown up. So, um, so the question is like, I like to say that you could spend every penny you have on trying to secure things and you'll never finish. You'll never ship a product. You'll never finish because there's always more to fix. So you have to be able to prioritize. You have limited money, limited resources, limited people. You have to prioritize where you want to put that effort and focus on the most important vulnerabilities, most important risks. Sometimes the risks exist in a place you don't expect. And another story from real life. Once upon a time, I worked for a place with a homegrown identity system for all their applications. So my job as the architect was to help replace that system for them. So I'm like, okay, this is a 15-year-old system. It's going to be terrible. And it was. No surprise. It was really bad. Okay, that's fine. So I asked the product marketing guy, like, do you have a plan if somebody breaks into our system? Like, yeah, I got a plan. I'm like, okay, I was surprised. Great, what's your plan? We will offer credit monitoring for anybody who wants it for 2 years. I'm like, that's a really good plan. That's a great plan. That costs $100 a person. They had 70 million users in the database. When databases get broken like that, about 10% of users take you up on that credit monitoring thing, on that offer. So that could have been 7 million users at $100 a piece. That could have been a $700 million risk on a password database. They had this bug open on the password database for years, years and years. It was in the backlog. It was never going to get fixed. Nobody thought it was a big deal. Nobody could quantify the risk. I got the business's attention really fast when I told them it was a $700 million risk, let me tell you. So you have to take all of that into account. They knew about this problem, but nobody cared. It didn't seem like a big deal. If somebody had broken into it, it would have been like one of the first or second largest password breaches ever. And I'd probably be selling used cars or something instead of being an architect still. So thank goodness nobody broke in. Okay, so how do you assess risk, right? So there's one simple heuristic here, the risk assessment matrix. I like it. It's simple. It's quick and it's simple. So basically, you're looking at the potential impact of a risk versus the potential probability of the risk. In a 3x3 matrix, low, medium, and high for each variable. So how do you judge low, medium, and high risk? How do you, or probability or impact, right? You can do it a bunch of different ways. Doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent. What I might do is I might say, okay, who's this going to impact? Is this going to impact one user? Will this impact one customer? Will this impact all my customers? That could be low, medium, and high. That's one way of going about it, right? I could say, for probability, I could say, okay, is this something somebody could break in a few minutes, a few hours, or a few days? How difficult is it to break in? So that might be, a couple of simple ways just to judge, a very rough way to judge whether something is low, medium, or high. And in this case, if something is high impact and high probability, it's red, critical, right? And likewise, yellow for medium for lower vulnerabilities and green for stuff that isn't quite as bad. But that might work for a startup. If you're Microsoft, you're going to have more red boxes because you have more to lose, right? If you're Microsoft, maybe like the three boxes on the top right corner are going to be high, right? And maybe there's more yellow than green in this diagram, right? So you have to take all of that into account as well. Okay. This is where everybody's going to start to get bored. But this is good stuff to know because if you start doing security type things in your job, you're going to be seeing this stuff a lot, right? So I'll start with the CVE, Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. So this is a list of publicly disclosed security flaws. This is maintained by MITRE, the U.S. defense contractor. And it's funded by CISA, C-I-S-A, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is part of the United States Department of Homeland Security. You don't have to remember all those things. You just have to remember CVEs and CVE-IDs. So, and you've probably run across them or at least maybe seen them, reported for, big vulnerabilities that get a lot of press. So CVEs can be reported from vendors, researchers, or individuals, and so they correspond to particular vulnerabilities in particular code bases. So you can see there how CVEs can be fixed independently, so you don't need to fix, say, several code bases to fix one vulnerability. So one code base for vulnerability, and you have acknowledgement by the vendor, you have some documentation. So like, for example, Log4j, like 6 months ago, that was very critical vulnerability. Everybody, hair on fire, right? And so if you look in the CVE and you look for Log4j, you'll find, I don't know, like 20 something, 22, 24 different CVE IDs just for Log4j because there are different variations of them, different code bases, and different fixes for all of those vulnerabilities. I'd like to drill down through here, but I'm probably running out of time, so I won't do that today. But you can go to that website, you can play around with it, you can do searches on it. I encourage you to, it's really interesting. So a couple of other things about the CVE database. Last year, there were more than 20,000 new vulnerabilities reported in all kinds of software packages. OSs, languages, third-party applications, all kinds of things. 20,000. So about every 30 minutes, 24/7, 365, there's a new vulnerability reported. So it's a constant stream. This is the sort of thing that unless you're a security person, nobody knows, right? Somebody says, I did a scan of my stuff, I'm good. I don't have to keep it up to date. I don't have to do anything else. And that's like, no. If by some miracle you had perfect architecture and you had a perfect implementation and your scans all came up clean because you had all the latest libraries on Monday morning, Tuesday morning you could be broken again because somebody found a vulnerability in some other package, like Log4j, right? Or a few years ago it was Heartbleed, right? That was Heartbleed, came from a Unix package that was 20 years old. So, yeah, and anyway, of those 20,000 new vulnerabilities from last year, about, what was it? More than 50% were either high or critical. 90% could be exploited without user interaction. So you could script an attack to try to exploit, So every day, the bad guys get more tools to attack. So that's kind of what you're up against in the security world. And really, these are just the ones that get reported. There are so many we don't know about yet, right? CVSS scores. The CVSS is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And you don't have to remember that part because I don't remember what it stands for either. But the important part to know is that this is a way of scoring vulnerabilities, determining risk. So before we had the risk matrix, a little 3 by 3, very simple, very easy, very fast. This is a little more complicated, but actually this is all the code over here. So this takes a number of different factors into account. If you ever wanted to figure it out for one of your products, you just fill in a form on the web, fill in 5 or 10 different parameters, and it'll give you a number 0 to 10. 9 to 10 is critical, 7 to 9 is high, etc. It's somewhat arbitrary, but it gives you a way of comparing one vulnerability against another vulnerability. And for the most part, if 2 different people scored the same vulnerability, it'll be close. Should be reasonably close. You also get different kinds of CVSS scores. So the score you'll get in the database that we just saw will be the basic score, which really refers to the vulnerability itself. The temporal group of the temporal score refers to, how mature is the attack? Is this like a fresh attack that's just been discovered and no one has figured out a way to automate it yet? Is this a fresh attack that nobody's figured out how to patch yet? Over time, the temporal score is going to change. And then you have the environmental score. What is true in your environment? Is this something that is, say, a vulnerability that's not reachable in your environment? Is this something that, or does this vulnerability affect some very, very, very important asset? If you're a bank, does this vulnerability allow people to get at the money? Or some customer data, something like that, right? At least now we can do a pretty picture. So this is a very simple threat model. So if you work with a security architect, you'll start seeing threat models, hopefully. So a threat model is a way of looking at the architecture of a system, but from a security perspective. From a security perspective, you want to look at assets, such as the database on the far right. You want to look at the red lines signify where you kind of change the privileges you need to access something, right? So a user accessing your system needs credentials to access your system. The services accessing your database, they also need credentials, right? So you have an elevation of a privilege boundary. And then being able to look at the system, you can look at the attack surface. You can see all the ways that the user can get in to your system. Could be APIs, could be your web interface, whatever it is that you can use to attack to get into a system can be an avenue for attacking it. And from there you can create, figure out what kind of vulnerabilities you have. So you have risks. So how do you manage a risk? So let's say, for example, just for a simple example, let's say you have an HTTP connection, unprotected HTTP. And your security guy says, well, we need to secure this HTTP connection. It's a vulnerability. What can you do? Well, you can avoid risk. You could close the port, right? You can't use the connection anymore, but you avoided the risk. As an example. You could mitigate. You could do HTTPS, a TLS connection. That would be great. You can delegate the risk to a third party. So you could say, okay, I'm going to get a dedicated MPLS line that's not visible on the open internet. Nobody can see it anymore. My data is secure. That's one example of delegating to a third party. Or you could just accept the risk. Maybe the asset is not valuable. Maybe you don't have time. Maybe you don't have people. Maybe a risk is just too expensive to fix. So maybe you'll write to your users and say, hey, be aware that this is out there. I don't, we're not going to fix this, but just be careful. This is a simple example. I mean, obviously it gets a lot more complicated, but it's also a balance with the business. You know, the business has 99 problems. Security is just one of them, right? So it may be obvious to a security guy, oh, you really need to fix this, like my conversation, at the start of the talk. But the business guy, he may have to decide, do I want to spend money on a new feature? Do I want to spend money on security? Do I want to spend money on advertising, on marketing, on a partnership with somebody else? You don't know. What you have to do is be able to give the business enough information so they can make good decisions, right? So it may seem ridiculous to accept the risk, but from a larger perspective, it may be the right thing to do. So this takes us back to the original slide, right? So in application security, we're talking the development side. In application security, the saying used to be 50% of vulnerabilities come from architectural decisions, right? 50% of application security flaws come from implementation, from coding, which is about right. But what I like to say now is that the third 50% comes from the operation side now, the deployment side, because you have so many more ways to have a problem, right? You have leave ports open on the deployment. You don't have the firewall configured. There's a million things that can go wrong there too. So I can go on for quite a bit if you wanted to talk about, the application security side. Could have a whole nother talk on the secure development lifecycle, the SDLC, or on the development side. Various different testing tools besides SAST, besides DAST. Threat modeling would be up there. All great stuff. I love that stuff. I'm great at parties because I love that stuff. You can imagine. So this kind of brings us all back to where we started from, really kind of looking at all of those bits. And similarly, if you're talking about the operations side, I can go a long time talking about, say, cloud security, right? Firewalls, ACLs. If you want to talk about subnetting, VPNs, the whole thing, right? So we'll leave it at that. Let's take it for. We went through those. Let's go through some questions if anybody has any questions. Or actually, I have questions for you. You didn't see that coming. To wake everybody up. I have a lot of topics I'd like to talk about the next time I do one of these talks. I'd like to know what you guys want to hear. So say, raise your hands and you can vote for multiple times. Who would like to hear about, say, cloud security architecture? My buddies, I love you guys. Who wants to hear about DevSecOps tools? About the same amount. You guys are out of luck because I don't really know much about the tools themselves. How about application security? You just don't know any better not to ask for that. Cryptography? All right. It's the same 5 people raising your hand for everything. How about AWS security? Yeah, I think that's the best one myself, but you never know. Okay, ask me questions. Nothing? Okay, let's all go home now. Somebody? Yay. If you yell it out, I'll repeat it. Okay, as you wish. Okay, here's a question. What do I recommend if an organization has DevOps and they want to insert the security? Great question. Um, you, you gotta start with your like one security heavy, I think, to really get it going. Like I've worked for an organization as recently as a cloud security architect. I was the first cloud guy. I was the first security guy. I was a cloud security architect. I was a cloud architect. I was the application security guy. I was the IT security guy. I was the pre-sales architect. I was the DevOps guy, and the privacy guy, right? Um, First, find somebody good, which is hard because there just aren't enough people. Another approach is to kind of try to grow people from within, which is hard because it takes time to grow people from inside, and two, it's hard to keep them. Because once people have those in-demand skills, it's really hard for the organization to keep them. I think the other kind of looking at it from a different perspective, the most important piece is to have buy-in from the executives on security. If the executives want security, they set the level of what the expectations are. And those expectations percolate on down the organization. If the executives want product out as fast as possible, that's what you're going to get. If the executives want high quality products, that's what you're going to get. If the executives want security, eventually you'll get it. If the executives don't care, it doesn't matter who you hire, you'll never get it. So, and now Alejandro's going to kick me out now. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Okay. Muchas gracias, Robert, por tu presentación. Viene de clave security.